Peter the Great. Undoubtedly, one of the greatest rulers of Russian history. He is the man who transformed a non-industrialized, militarily weak state into the rising power of Eastern Europe. But even he had blunders that could lead to his ultimate end. Here is the Pruth campaign of 1711, that Peter had one of the most dramatic episodes of his life. This is a cooperation with the fellow channel Russian Eagles, and now enjoy the history. (1709) Besides what was going on in Western Europe in the War of Spanish Succession, this year would mark the turning point of the Great Northern War. Charles XII, who until now had a series of victories over the coalition of Denmark, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Saxony, and Russia, met the disaster in his invasion of Russia, losing a considerable proportion of his men even before fighting. In July 1709, his army was virtually destroyed by the Russian forces under the overall command of Peter himself. Fearing Russia was now a growing power in the north, the Turks carefully followed the tidings of the Great Northern War. The Grand Vizier Çorlulu Ali Pasha had offered the aid of the Crimean Tatars. This was in fact one of the main reasons why Charles marched south. However, as this help never materialized, with the few fortunate fugitives along with Ivan Mazepa, the leader of the Cossacks who betrayed Peter, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire. From this point, the Swedish king began to wave intrigues by sending his officers to Constantinople to convince the Sultan to fight the Russians. Initially, the Turks were following an uncertain policy in the north. While Sultan Ahmet the Turk seemed to not want a war with Russia, he was certainly not pleased to see the building of a Russian fleet in Azov. On the other hand, Peter, although not really fearing a break with the Ottomans, wanted to maintain a strong grip on his southern border. All Russian forces were supposed to be used for the war with Sweden in the north, and the conclusion of a long-awaited peace with it on favorable terms. However, the presence of Charles XII in the Ottoman realm was disgusting to him. According to the Ottoman system, when a sultan passed away, the new one had to sign all the treaties in his own name. As Sultan Mustafa II was dethroned in 1703 in a coup, Ahmet III had to renew the Treaty of Constantinople, which was signed in 1700 with the Russians. As both sides had concerns, Charles hopefully believed that the outbreak of war was soon. Yet, when the two monarchs renewed the peace treaty, the exiled king was enraged. But good news were soon to follow. In 1710, thanks to the Swedish intrigues and an opposing party in the Ottoman court, Çorlulu Pasha, who was accused of being a Russian agent, was deposed. A Swede on a file, Köprülü Numan Pasha, took the post, and he promised Charles to be escorted with a force of 40,000 men to his empire via Poland. Peter, sensing the Ottomans' changing attitude against Russia, wrote 2 missives to be dispatched to Constantinople. Here he was complaining about the fact that the Turkish side was not obeying the articles which compelled them to send King Charles. He was suggesting that the Swedish king could return his land via Central Europe, and at least requesting by the Ottomans to return the Cossacks to him. Unfortunately, these 2 missives would be left without any answer. Moreover, in August 1710, the leading figure of the war-supporting party, Baltacı Mehmet Pasha, was assigned as the Grand Vizier. By this stage of diplomacy, the Ottoman court was not only under the influence of the Swedish king, but also the European states like England, Holland, and especially France. In October 1710, Charles was already permitted to raid the Russian land by the Sultan. Meanwhile, Peter had written new missives to both the Ottoman Sultan and the European governments. While he was stating the warmonger attitude of the Ottoman court to the Europeans, he was still seeking a possibility of keeping the peace. This time, his envy could not even pass the Ottoman border as he was imprisoned by the Turks. Officially, in November 1710, the war was begun. As it was understood that there was no way of preventing the war, Peter began his preparations with his usual energy. He first tried to make an alliance with the Habsburg monarchy, but Vienna rejected this offer as they wanted to strengthen neither the Russian or the Turkish influence. Peter also could not find help from Poland, as King August II did not want a new conflict with the Turks and made various territorial demands. One-on-one with the Ottomans, Peter devised a lightning-speed campaign. With the Orthodox Slavic Balkan nations' loyalty to the Ottomans wavering, he would encourage them to fight the common enemy together. Hence, he would adopt an offensive strategy. By this time, the Ottoman Empire was following a policy of consolidating her authority in the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. To succeed, a noble from Constantinople named Dmitry Cantemir was appointed as the Prince of Moldavia. Although he was assured that no yearly taxes would be taken from him, soon he found himself both had to pay the taxes and raise an army for the Ottomans. The prince suddenly promised Tsar to defect to him and to provide the necessary provisions for an offensive campaign. Peter's transfer of the operation to the Balkans was risky, but it did not necessarily threaten disaster. Nevertheless, he certainly underestimated the Ottoman army. Unlike the elaborate operations against the Swedes, the campaign of 1711 was a risky improvisation. 12,000 recruits were mobilized into the southern army. In total, the Russian army would number about 38,000 men by the start of the campaign. In Moscow, the declaration of war on the Turks was held solemnly. Before leaving Moscow, the Tsar created the Senate, a temporary institution of power in the monarch's absence, and in March 1711, Peter joined the army with his wife Catherine. On the way, he had to delay because of a severe 2-week illness. On the other hand, Ahmet III was planning to gather a massive army with a huge quantity of guns against the Russian Tsar. He believed that even if it had not the quality of the past centuries, an army of nearly 200,000 men would suffice to defeat Peter. Overall, the morale was too high in both armies. The Russian army was commanded by Field Marshal Sheremetev. Sheremetev's task was to reach the Danube, to prevent the enemy from reaching the left bank of the river, and thus reliably guarantee the transfer of Wallachia and Moldavia to the Russian side. The reserve option included leaving the Danube principalities under the Turks' control and pulling all the Orthodox volunteers behind the Dniester River. The Ottoman army, on the other side, was commanded by Baltacı Mehmet Pasha, who understood little of warfare and owed his rise to power to introduce more than his merits. The army began its movements on the 3rd of June from Adrianople to the Danube River. Simultaneously, a 300-piece strong fleet was sent to the Black Sea to begin an operation in Azov. The Russians lost the race to the Danube. On the 8th of June, Sheremetev's army was in Bratislav on the southern Bug River, hundreds of kilometers away from the target. On the other hand, on the 15th of June, the Turks reached the Danube. This event forced Brankovanu of Wallachia to finally take the Ottoman side. As the Russian army began to cross the Dniester River, Prince Cantemir of Moldavia proclaimed that his principality passes under the Russian protectorate. It wasn't until the end of June that Baltacı began to move along the eastern bank of the Pruth River. Having learned of the enemy's actions, Sheremetev called a council of war, at which it was decided to cross the Pruth and move to Yashi. Sheremetev's avoiding the direct road to the Danube and slowness in collecting provisions provoked the Tsar's anger. To cover the direction from the Bender side, a garrison of 4,000 men was left in Soroki, and 2,000 soldiers were left in Mogilev Podolsky. In fact, the march to the Danube was poorly prepared, without detailed calculation of distances and the necessary amount of food and forage. The Russian army moved to the west bank of the Pruth to go down to Wallachia, but had no intelligence of the enemy. Having inspected Sheremetev's army on the 5th of July, Peter I ordered to build crossings across the Pruth, which were ready in 5 days. When the Guard and the rest of the infantry and cavalry regiments joined Sheremetev's corps, the command of the entire army passed into the Tsar's hands. When Peter entered the city of Yashi, he sent General Rene to capture the Ottoman supply depot Brailov. Khan Devlet Giray of Crimea could not prevent the crossing of the Pruth, but he managed to slow down the movement. The opponents would converge on different sides of the Pruth. On the 20th of July, Mehmed Pasha from the Danube moved up to the eastern bank of the Pruth. There was no Russian regular reconnaissance, nor rather any contacts of cavalry detachments with the enemy. By contrast, the Crimean Tatar cavalry was informing Baltaji about every step of Peter. Meanwhile, on the 18th of July, the entire Russian army had crossed the Pruth and moved down along the west bank. The artillery was lagging. The soldiers no longer suffered from hunger and thirst, but forage for horses was still insufficient. Spies reported that the Turks were building bridges on the west bank of the Pruth. The Russian army decided to await the enemy even further to the right side, to Sireta. At this time, the Tatar cavalry cut off the Tsar's communications with the rear and supply wagons. As the Ottoman vanguard was only 18 kilometers away from the Russians, the Russian army was preparing to enclose itself with a retrenchment as at Poltava. On the 19th of July, the Tsar's army stopped for a rest at near Stanileshti. The Russian vanguard, about 13,000 men, moved southward, following orders to keep the enemy from crossing the Pruth. If the enemy was not detected, these forces were to march to the Danube. Yet, General Janus' detachment had advanced quite far from the main army. The Tatars were the first to discover the Russian vanguard, and several Russians were captured. At afternoon, several thousand Sipahis and Tatars crossed and moved towards Janus. After a short reconnaissance, Janus imagined that the entire Ottoman army was in front of him, and he immediately sent news to the Tsar. With the arrival of the news, Peter became alarmed, and after conferring with his generals, ordered Janus to join the main army. On the 19th of July, the Turks did not attack the Russian vanguard as they had concerned about the quality of their own units. In the night, the Russian vanguard began to retreat, which at first the Turkish intelligence surprisingly did not notice. At dawn on the 20th of July, the Turks cautiously began the crossing of the river. But when the news of the Russian retreat came, the Ottoman army was encouraged. Up to 20,000 Turks led by Khan Devlet Giray of Crimea pursued the enemy, but because of the lack of artillery, tried not to come close. Therefore, the Russian vanguard joined the main army. The next day, Tsar Peter would acquire a crucial intelligence about the enemy's numerical strength by a prisoner, that the Ottoman army was numbering more than 140,000 men. At the council, which was assembled on the same day, the Russian High Command decided to burn some of the heavy carts and withdraw along the Pruth to Yashi to find a favorable field to fight. Leaving to the north, the Russians tried to move quickly, but there was some disorder because of the darkness. On the other hand, in the night of the 21st of July, the main crossing of the Ottoman forces began. By the afternoon of the same day, Tatars and Sipahis rushed into one of them, and the Tsar's army could not avoid breaking up the columns. The Turkish horsemen plundered almost the entire transport there and inflicted considerable casualties on the Moldavian forces and the Russian army. Thanks to the crucial intervention of the Tatar cavalry, the Russian army was stopped. Sighting the Ottoman infantry on the horizon, the Tsar was now caught with his entire army. About 2 years before, he had inflicted a decisive defeat on the Swedish King Charles XII when the latter was forced to fight under similar circumstances. Yet, was this also the final chapter for Peter's legacy?